In the summer of 1965, a vehicle crossed the new causeway connecting Oak Island to the Nova Scotia mainland for what may have been among the first times anyone had done so without oars or rope, or the low flat bottom of a wooden barge. The pavement was new enough that the concrete still held a faint gray pallor, unstained by seasons, and its surface laid across a narrow raised bed of fill material, extending from the mainland shore to the island's eastern edge, over a crossing of tidal water so shallow that at low tide the exposed mud and gravel on either side showed plainly through the surface. The tires made a particular sound on that new pavement, a clean, dry contact, quite unlike the irregular planking or gravel that had served the site before, and the mainland was visible in the rear window as the island's low tree line came forward and resolved itself into something specific. Individual spruce and maple, the ground-level shrubbery of the island's edge, a flat horizon that refused to rise. The causeway was not long. The crossing from mainland to island measured only a few hundred meters, and the tidal water on either side was shallow enough in places to wade. But before 1965, those few hundred meters had constituted a genuine separation, one that required a boat, a barge, a tide table, and favorable weather, and that had effectively governed the rhythm of every excavation attempt since the earliest organized dig in the first years of the 19th century. The causeway changed that. Not the mystery, nothing about the concrete crossing altered what lay beneath the island's eastern end, but the practical access, the logistical calculation, the question of whether a team could move heavy equipment to the site and sustain an operation through seasons when the Atlantic weather made small boat traffic unreliable. Oak Island sits in Mahone Bay, which is part of Nova Scotia's South Shore in Lunenburg County, approximately 8 kilometers south of the community of Western Shore. The precise coordinates place the island at roughly 5 degrees north latitude, well within the temperate Atlantic coastal zone, where the climate runs to cold, wet winters, moderate and sometimes overcast summers, and a persistent maritime influence that complicates any kind of sustained outdoor work. The island itself covers approximately 57 hectares, which is modest even by the standard of the bay's smaller islands, and its terrain is notably flat, rising only a few meters above sea level. At its highest point, its interior forested, its shoreline irregular in the way of glacially shaped Atlantic island edges. The flatness is not incidental. A topographical survey map produced in the early 20th century shows the island's contour lines so closely spaced, in so many places nearly indistinguishable from one another, that the map reads almost like a plan view, with no meaningful elevation change recorded. The ground simply does not rise to any height that would be visible from a distance. Seen from the water, the island presents a horizontal band of dark tree cover sitting at sea level, its canopy the uppermost visible feature, with nothing beneath it suggesting any significant topographic variation. The survey confirms what casual observation would suggest, that the island is, in purely geographic terms, one of the bay's unremarkable low-lying members, distinguished from its neighbors by nothing that can be read from a chart. Mahone Bay contains approximately 360 islands in total, of varying sizes, most of them forested and most of them uninhabited. The bay's name is believed by some researchers to derive from the French word mahon, referring to a type of low-lying vessel, historically associated with privateers, a vessel designed for concealment and shallow water operation, suited to a coastline of exactly this kind, with its many protected anchorages and its scattered island cover. The derivation is not universally accepted, and the range of documented explanations for the bay's name extends beyond the privateer vessel theory. But the connection has been noted often enough in regional histories to merit mention as one of the threads of interpretation that have long been woven through the area's reputation. What the name means in practical terms, for anyone thinking about the bay from the perspective of its geography, is that the water is sheltered by comparison with the open Atlantic beyond it, that the islands provide natural concealment for vessels moving between them, and that the combination of protected water and forested shorelines makes the bay's history as a place of private transaction, whether trading, privateering, or simply moving goods without inspection, at least plausible to researchers who have studied it. The bay's geography does not confirm any particular account. It simply describes a set of physical conditions that several different kinds of historical activity would have found useful. Oak Island is not the largest or the most centrally located of those 360 islands. It sits near the southern edge of the bay, somewhat removed from the principal historical navigation routes, and its connection to the Nova Scotia mainland across the shallow tidal flat is close enough that the island was never entirely isolated from the communities on the shore. The mainland town of Western Shore, visible from the island's northern edge on a clear day, was close enough that early residents of the island, and there were some, families who farmed its interior in the 19th century, could cross regularly and did. The island was not a wilderness in any absolute sense. It was a working piece of land in a settled bay, its eastern section wooded, and its interior capable of modest agricultural use. That said, the tidal flat between the island's northern shore and the mainland, before the 1965 causeway was built, was a genuine physical obstacle in the way that tidal water always is. Crossing it required timing. It required a vessel, however small. It required a day when the weather did not make a short crossing across open bay water hazardous, and in a Nova Scotia winter, that was not always a given. Historical photographs taken before the causeway show supply barges loaded at the mainland shore, wooden crates, iron equipment, pump components, drilling apparatus stacked in flat gray morning light on the barge deck, ready for the short but weather-dependent passage to the island. The equipment visible in those photographs tells a particular story about the logistical cost of sustained excavation work at a site accessible only by water. Every piece of machinery had to be transported across tidal water, assembled on site, and either overwintered on the island or removed before the weather made retrieval impractical. The photographs are not glamorous documents. They show working people in working conditions, the flat light of a Nova Scotia morning, the practical gravity of loading heavy equipment onto a barge, with the knowledge that the barge is the only way the equipment gets to the site. The water in those images has the gray, unreflective look of Atlantic coastal water in the colder months, and the mainland shore behind the barge is low and unspectacular. These are records of logistics, not adventure. They confirm that access to Oak Island before 1965 was real, regular, and effortful, that the island was reachable, but never simply reached. Nova Scotia's climate imposes a particular rhythm on outdoor work of the kind that Oak Island's excavations have always required. The winters are cold and wet, with precipitation that arrives as rain or snow in more or less equal measure depending on the season, and the tidal flooding that has characterized every serious attempt to drain the pit's lower depths is worse in the colder months, when the ground is harder, pumping machinery runs less efficiently, and the cost of maintaining a crew on site rises sharply. Several excavation teams across the island's long history of organized digging have abandoned seasonal operations, not because the work had reached a natural stopping point, but because the combination of incoming autumn water, Deteriorating weather and the economic impossibility of continued pumping made it impractical to stay. The island does not cooperate with excavation schedules. It keeps its own seasonal calendar, and that calendar is governed by the Atlantic. The summers are more workable, but not reliably so. Nova Scotia's maritime climate produces weather that shifts with enough frequency to make extended outdoor operations uncertain, and the bay's conditions, wind, swell, and tidal variation, affect the island's western and southern shores in ways that complicate both landing of equipment and operation of drainage works near the water's edge. The humidity that comes with the Bay of Fundy-influenced regional climate means that the upper layers of the island's soil remain saturated for much of the year, and excavations that might be straightforward in a drier climate require more bracing, more pumping, and more attention to wall stability than the same work conducted elsewhere. The 57 hectares of Oak Island do not all have the same character. The island's interior holds the majority of its forested ground, second-growth woodland of the kind that replaced earlier clearing when farming activities declined, and the eastern end, where the concentrated excavation work has always taken place, is lower and wetter than the island's western section. The swamp that occupies a significant portion of the island's interior, and that has been the focus of considerable investigation in more recent years, is a natural feature of the low-lying terrain, its boundaries shifting somewhat with seasonal water levels, its surface appearance varying between open water and dense wetland vegetation, depending on conditions. The swamp is not an artifact of the excavations. It is part of the island's natural topography, a consequence of flat land sitting close to sea level in a wet climate. The island's shoreline varies considerably from one side to the other. The northern shore, facing the mainland, and the shallow tidal flat that the causeway now crosses, is the most sheltered, its water protected by the configuration of the bay and the proximity of the land. The southern shore faces more open water and receives a greater degree of tidal exposure. Smith's Cove, on the island's eastern end, is a small tidal beach that has been the focus of particular attention in the history of excavation work at the site. Its sand and gravel surface, its tidal dynamics, and its proximity to the main excavation area have made it a recurring location in the island's documented history. Smith's Cove is not dramatic as a landscape feature. It is a modest beach on the eastern side of a small island in a sheltered bay, unremarkable to anyone who had not read the records of what previous excavators reported finding beneath its surface. The causeway that made year-round vehicle access to the island possible was completed in 1965, replacing what had been, for approximately 170 years of organized activity at the site, a crossing that required a vessel and a favorable tide. The construction of the causeway was itself a significant investment, undertaken by a partnership that held excavation rights to the island at that time, and it permanently altered the practical relationship between the island and the mainland in a way that no subsequent change has reversed. Vehicles now cross on a surface of concrete that sits only slightly above the tidal water on either side, the crossing so low and narrow that the water is audible from a car window at high tide, the bay's gray surface extending in both directions from the causeway's edges. The year 1965 is a significant one in the island's history for reasons that extend beyond the construction of the causeway. But as a piece of infrastructure, the causeway represents something straightforward: the decision by a group of investors to commit enough capital to the site that permanent land access became worth its cost. The investment in the causeway was an act of confidence, perhaps more than was warranted, as the subsequent history of the site would demonstrate, and it changed the island from a place that required a boat into a place that required only a short drive on a narrow concrete road above tidal water. The drive across the causeway takes less than a minute. The water on either side is visible for the entire crossing, and the transition from mainland to island is marked not by any dramatic change in landscape, but by a subtle shift in the quality of the air and the sound of the tires on the causeway's surface. And then the island's tree line is close, and the road continues. And Oak Island is simply where the vehicle is. The low silhouette of the island seen from the water is the most persistent visual fact about the place. From any distance, and from any of the bay's surrounding islands or mainland vantage points, Oak Island presents the same horizontal profile: dark tree canopy at sea level, no significant elevation, no feature that distinguishes it from the dozens of other forested islands scattered across Mahone Bay in every direction. The 360 islands of the bay include many with similar profiles, similar dimensions, similar combinations of forested interior and irregular shoreline, and from the water at any distance beyond a few hundred meters, Oak Island does not distinguish itself from its neighbors. That visual indistinguishability is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is mysterious, but because it is simply accurate. The island that has absorbed more documented excavation effort and more capital investment than perhaps any other small island in North American history looks, from the water, like the others around it. The survey maps confirm the flatness. The photographs confirm the unremarkable tree line. The coordinates place it precisely in the southern part of Mahone Bay, roughly 5 degrees north, a specific and mappable location on a coast that has been charted with increasing precision since the 18th century. The bay's geography is well documented. Charts produced for navigational use in the 18th and 19th centuries show the island's position accurately, name the surrounding water features, and indicate the shallow tidal approaches that govern vessel access to the island's northern shore. These are working documents, charts made for mariners, not for mystery, and their detail is the detail of practical necessity: depths, hazards, anchorages, landmarks. Oak Island appears on those charts as a navigational object, something to be aware of and accounted for, not something to seek out. The Lunenburg County context places the island in a region of Nova Scotia that was settled primarily by German-speaking Protestant immigrants brought to the province by the British colonial administration in the 1750s, a process known as the Foreign Protestant Immigration, which populated the South Shore with communities whose descendants still make up a significant portion of the regional population. Western Shore, the mainland community closest to Oak Island, sits within this settled agricultural and coastal landscape. Its history documented in the usual records of births, land grants, census returns, and church registers that characterize 18th and 19th century Nova Scotia settlement. The island itself was parceled into land grants, farmed in portions, and inhabited by working families before excavation interests transformed its eastern end into a site of organized digging. The transition from agricultural land to excavation site was gradual. The 1795 episode, the alleged discovery that first drew organized attention to the island's eastern end, did not immediately bring heavy equipment or large investment. It brought curiosity, local interest, and eventually, in the early years of the 19th century, the first properly organized attempt to determine what might lie beneath a circular depression in the forest floor. But the island remained inhabited by farming families through much of the 19th century, and the excavations coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with the ordinary life of the land around them. The farming is now largely gone, replaced by excavation infrastructure, fencing, and the various structures built by the successive teams that have held rights to the site. The second growth forest has reclaimed much of what was cleared for agricultural use. The swamp occupies its portion of the interior. The eastern end of the island, where the concentrated excavation work has always been centered, has been extensively disturbed by 2 centuries of digging, drilling, and attempts at drainage, its original topography obscured by the accumulated intervention of many hands. The island's flat profile seen from the water does not record any of this. From the bay, the tree line sits at sea level, undifferentiated from the canopy of the surrounding islands, and the geology beneath it, the saturated glacial till, the deep shaft, the dark water that has flooded the lower levels of every major excavation since the early 19th century, is entirely invisible. The water between the mainland and the island is shallow and tidal, its surface reflecting the sky in the way of sheltered coastal water. The bay extends in every direction toward its other 359 islands, their profiles similarly low and dark against the horizon. At the end of a November afternoon, when the light comes from a low angle and the sky over Mahoney Bay holds the particular flat gray of a Nova Scotia autumn, the island's tree line is nearly the same tone as the water around it. The contrast between the dark vegetation and the gray bay surface is subtle, not dramatic, not arranged for effect, simply the result of latitude, season, and the quality of Atlantic coastal light in the late autumn. The island sits on the water in that light as it has always sat, its profile unchanged by whatever attention has been directed at it, its appearance from the water making no argument for anything. The bay goes on around it. The other islands stretch toward the mainland and toward the open water to the south, their own dark tree lines arranged in the distance like a loose punctuation of the gray surface. The October and November swells that come in from the Atlantic south of the bay's outer islands send long, low movements through the water that flatten to almost nothing in the sheltered interior of the bay, arriving at the island's southern shore as a faint rhythmic motion at the waterline, audible only close to the shore, gone a few meters inland. None of the island's geography is unusual for this coast. The topography, the soil type, the tidal dynamics, the climate, these are features shared by dozens of similar islands in Mahoney Bay, and hundreds more across Nova Scotia's south shore. The island's distinction is not geographic. It has never been geographic. The charts and survey maps and topographical surveys produced over 2 centuries of increasing cartographic precision have consistently described a small, flat, moderately forested island in a sheltered bay, unremarkable in its physical particulars, precisely located, accurately measured, and from the water at the end of a November afternoon, with the light flat and the bay gray, and the other islands ranged in every direction at sea level, there is nothing about Oak Island's dark tree line that would draw a second glance from someone crossing the bay who had not already known what to look for, nothing in its low profile against the sky that suggests anything other than what the survey maps confirm: a small island, close to sea level, sitting in a bay with 359 others, its character geographic and ordinary, holding whatever it holds beneath the still water of its eastern end in the quiet and unremarkable dark. The causeway connects it to the mainland in a single unassuming line. The tidal water on either side of that narrow concrete crossing comes in and goes out on the schedule the tide tables predict. The mainland is visible behind the crossing, and the island's tree line is ahead of it, and between them the water is shallow enough at low tide to show the gravel bottom through its gray surface. The connection is simple. It was built to last. And the island at the other end of it looks in every direction exactly like the bay that surrounds it. A circular depression in the forest floor of Oak Island's eastern end, perhaps half a meter deep, with an oak tree standing at its edge, whose single large branch extends directly over the center of the hollow. That is the image the earliest accounts preserve. A low place in the ground, roughly 4 meters across, the soil already disturbed in a way that suggested prior human effort, not the random settling of a fallen root system, not a natural sinkhole, but something more deliberately shaped, a geometry that spoke of intention. The branch overhead bore what early accounts described as evidence of having supported a tackle arrangement, a smooth worn mark on the bark where rope or chain had rested across the wood over a long period of time, the kind of mark that accumulates slowly through repeated loading, through sustained work that required the mechanical advantage of a pulley overhead. The ground below it had subsided. Something had been removed from below, or placed below, or both. This was Oak Island in the summer of 1795, and the 3 people who stood at the edge of that depression and looked down into it were not engineers or investors or professional salvagers. They were teenagers. Daniel McGinnis, the first to find the site, was a settler on the island's eastern end, and the depression was near his property. He returned with 2 friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughn, and the 3 of them began to dig. What happened next exists in the historical record in a particular and interesting way, and that way is worth understanding before the details of the dig are described. The first known newspaper account of the Oak Island digging appeared in 1862 in the Liverpool Transcript of Nova Scotia, nearly 67 years after the alleged summer of discovery. No contemporaneous press coverage from 1795 has survived. No diary entry from McGinnis describing his first look at that branch-shaded depression. No letter from Vaughn to a relative describing what they found at 10 feet, or 20, or 30. The foundational story of Oak Island was reconstructed from oral tradition and from the later testimony of individuals claiming direct or secondhand knowledge of the original events, and this reconstruction happened decades after those events took place. That does not make the story false. Oral traditions carry genuine information. Secondhand testimony, carefully gathered, can be reliable. The gap between event and documentation is a fact about the record, not a verdict on the record's contents, and it is exactly the kind of fact the narration should hold clearly, so that what is built on top of it rests on honest ground. The account as reconstructed describes the 3 young men digging into the depression and finding at approximately 2 feet below the surface a layer of flagstones. The stones were not native to the immediate area. They had been brought from elsewhere and set deliberately as a cover or marker for the shaft beneath. Below the flagstones, the ground opened into a circular pit approximately 4 meters wide, its walls revealing something that the earth does not produce on its own: timber. Hewn oak logs, hand-cut and fitted tightly across the shaft's circular circumference, set at intervals that recurred with regularity as the digging proceeded downward. The first platform came at 10 feet, the second at 20, the third at 30. The logs themselves were fitted into the shaft walls rather than merely resting across them, a detail noted in later reconstructed accounts that suggests the platforms were installed during the original construction of the shaft, not as afterthoughts. They had been engineered into the structure as it was built. The walls of the shaft between the platforms showed no signs of natural collapse or subsidence. The shape held at 30 feet, lacking the equipment to go further, and without any means of shoring the walls against collapse. As they dug deeper, McGinnis, Smith, and Vaughn stopped. The pit stayed where it was. the oak branch continued to extend over its center. The flagstones, presumably, remained somewhere in the disturbed soil around the edges. What drew the three of them back to the site, and what drew others into the story, was not only what they had found, but what the regular intervals of timber platforms implied about what might lie below the level they had reached. A structure that went to 30 feet with engineered platforms at every 10 had a logic. That logic extended downward. The years between 1795 and the next significant excavation passed without organized recovery effort, though the site does not appear to have been forgotten. John Smith, one of the original three, acquired land on the eastern end of Oak Island and remained connected to the area. Anthony Vaughn's family stayed in the region. The story of the pit circulated in the way that stories about hidden things circulate in small coastal communities, passed from person to person, accumulating detail held as local knowledge. It was this local knowledge that eventually reached Simeon Linz, a businessman in Nova Scotia who understood the logical implication of the young men's account. A shaft that deep, with platforms that regular, and flagstones at its entrance, suggested not a natural feature and not an accident of geology. It suggested a project of that scale, at that depth, carried out at some point before 1795 in a relatively remote location on a tidal island, suggested something worth finding. Lines assembled investors and workers, the company that history would come to call the Onslow Company, after the area of Nova Scotia where many of its members originated, and around 1804, approximately 9 years after the original discovery, formal organized excavation of the money pit began. The Onslow Company's dig went deeper than the three teenagers had gone, and what it found in the additional depth was consistent with the pattern already established, and then considerably stranger. The oak platforms continued at their regular intervals, appearing at approximately every 10 feet, as the earlier dig had suggested they would. At 40 feet, workers found charcoal laid in a thin layer across the platform. At 50 feet, putty, a material that, like the charcoal, had no natural explanation in the geology of a Nova Scotia coastal island and had clearly been placed deliberately. At 60 feet, another material that the later reconstructed accounts would describe as coconut fiber, pressed into a layer across the shaft. Coconut palms do not grow in Nova Scotia. They do not grow in the Atlantic Maritime provinces. Coconut fiber, in a sealed pit 60 feet below the surface of a Nova Scotia island, had traveled a considerable distance before arriving in that position. The platform sequence continued. The charcoal, the putty, the coconut fiber, each layer deliberate, each material chosen with some purpose that the diggers in 1804 were working to understand from the outside. At approximately 90 feet, the deepest the Onslow Company would reach, workers encountered something that the account describes as a large flat stone bearing inscribed markings. The stone was noted and recorded by those present, its symbols observed, and the dig continued through and below it. Then the morning came when everything changed. Workers arrived at the site to find the pit flooded. The water sat at approximately 60 feet below ground level, its surface still in the early morning air. A dark circle visible inside the circular shaft mouth at ground level. They tried a hand pump. They organized bucket chains. They worked through the day and into the following day and made no progress against the water. The volume entering the pit was greater than any human-powered removal system could match. The water rose and fell in a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, and as workers who knew the local tides observed it through the course of the day, the correspondence became clear. The water inside the pit was moving in synchrony with the Atlantic Ocean. Something connected the flooded shaft to the tidal sea, not by coincidence, not by the accident of a high water table, but by design. The flooding had not happened because of rain. It had not happened because of a natural aquifer that the dig had finally breached. It had happened because the pit, when the digging reached a critical depth, had connected to a system that brought ocean water in. This was the discovery, or rather, this was the implication that the flooded shaft forced upon everyone who observed it, that whatever the pit contained, it had been constructed with a protection mechanism. The shaft went deep. It held engineered platforms. It contained deliberate deposits of charcoal, putty, and tropical fiber, and it connected somehow to the tidal sea. The Onslow Company could not overcome the water. The hand pump did not make a sufficient difference. The bucket chains did not make a sufficient difference. The water kept its own schedule, rising and falling with the ocean beyond the tree line, and the bottom of the shaft, the depth below 90 feet, the depth below the inscribed stone, the depth from which the flooding had originated, remained unreachable. The company dissolved without confirmed recovery. The inscribed stone, according to the accounts, was pulled from the pit during the excavation. It was a flat stone, described in various accounts as bearing a pattern of symbols that did not correspond to any alphabetic system that the workers could recognize. What happened to it next is where the record becomes considerably more uncertain. For decades, the stone's location after the excavation was unclear, passed from one person to another, referenced in accounts of the period but not precisely located. A later tradition, the details of which appear in several 19th century accounts, holds that the stone was eventually brought to Halifax, where it found its way into the possession of a bookbinder, and that for a significant period it served as a functional object in his shop, a flat hearthstone set into the floor or base of the fireplace. The symbols facing upward or sideways or downward, depending on the account, the inscriptions slowly obscured by soot and foot traffic and the indifferent passage of daily work. At some point, and this too is imprecisely recorded, a professor of languages was reportedly brought to examine the stone and produced a translation of the symbols that read, in the account most frequently repeated, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. This translation has never been independently verified. The methodology by which the professor arrived at it from an apparently non-alphabetic symbol set is not described in surviving accounts. And the stone itself, wherever it ended up after the Halifax bookbinder's shop, has not been found. It is one of the more remarkable objects in the Oak Island story, a key piece of physical evidence from the pit's deepest penetrated layer, last seen performing the function of a hearthstone in a tradesman's shop, its symbols described by those who saw them, but not reproducible from any surviving image or reliable copy. The gap between events and documentation observed at the beginning, the 67 years between McGinnis's discovery and the first newspaper account, shaped not only the foundational story, but also the stories of these early objects, these early finds. The Onslow Company's dig was undocumented in real time, or at least no documents from that real time have been located and confirmed. What is known of it comes from accounts assembled later, from participants' later recollections, and the recollections of those who spoke with participants, set down in newspaper columns and pamphlets, and letters across the decades following, each transmission carrying the risks that all oral reconstruction carries. The smoothing of uncertainty, the sharpening of detail, the slow substitution of interpretation for raw memory. What survived those transmissions, and what the later excavation record would confirm in physical terms, was the coconut fiber. The fiber was not unique to the 60-foot layer. The Onslow Company's workers encountered it, and later companies would encounter it again at different depths and in different locations. It was material that had no natural explanation in this geography. It could not have arrived in a sealed underground shaft by wind or water transport. Someone had carried it to this island, almost certainly as ballast, as the fiber was commonly used in tropical and subtropical ports to cushion cargo, a cheap and available packing material that ships loaded by the ton when filling their holds. The fiber would have been compact, dry, and easy to handle in large quantities. As a filtration material in a hydraulic system, a use that later excavations would begin to suggest, it had specific and practical properties. It was porous, it was organic, and it held its structure under compression. The coconut fiber in the sealed shaft in 1804 was not random debris. It was a construction material brought from somewhere outside Nova Scotia to serve a deliberate function in a deliberate structure. That is what the record confirms. The question the record does not answer is by whom, or when, or why, and the particular combination of those three unanswered questions is why the Onslow Company's failure to reach the bottom of the pit did not end the story of Oak Island. It deepened it. The story that circulated after the Onslow Company's work was no longer the story of a teenage settler finding a curious depression in the forest. It was the story of a shaft 90 feet deep, regularly timbered with hand-hewn oak platforms, containing deliberate layers of charcoal and putty and coconut fiber, bearing a flat inscribed stone at its lowest reach depth, protected from penetration by a flood mechanism that drew seawater in at tidal pressure faster than any hand-powered system could remove it. That story had a different weight. That story drew different people. The Halifax Colonist published its account of Oak Island in January 1864. The reporter was working 60 years after the Onslow dig, drawing on the recollections of individuals in the region who claimed first-hand or closely second-hand knowledge of the events described. The Colonist article is one of the primary documentary sources for the early period of Oak Island's history, a foundational account composed in retrospect from memory by a journalist who understood the inherent drama of what he was recording, which is to say that it carries all the qualities and all the limitations of that genre. It established the story in print. It gave the three teenagers their names, McGinnis, Smith, Vaughn, in a form that could be reproduced and referenced. It gave the Onslow Company a shape in the public record, and it invited readers to consider what the pit was, who had made it, and what it contained. Questions that the 60 years between the Onslow dig and the article's publication had done nothing to answer. Reading the Colonist account now, its dense columns of 19th century typeset, carrying the story in the careful reconstructed language of a journalist working from second-hand memory, the quality of the uncertainty is legible. The account does not pretend to certainty. It does not have. The phrasings hedge gently, it is said, according to those who remember, reports suggest, and the hedges are honest. They signal a writer who understood that he was assembling a story from fragments, and who chose to assemble it faithfully rather than smooth the fragments away. The inscribed stone appears in the Colonist account. The coconut fiber appears. The flooding of the shaft appears, and the failure of the hand pump, and the water rising and falling with the tide. These elements are consistent across multiple accounts of the period, which is a form of corroboration even when no single account has the authority of a contemporaneous document. There is something worth holding about the coconut fiber in particular as a piece of evidence. It is physical. It does not rely on memory. Whoever found it, and the record of finding it however delayed in its documentation, is the record of an encounter with an object that had no natural reason to exist where it existed. Later excavations would confirm the presence of coconut fiber in contexts that extended beyond the main shaft, fiber recovered from the tidal area of Smith's Cove in arrangements that suggested deliberate construction rather than accidental deposit. The fiber was not a mistake in the record. It was a material present in quantity requiring explanation. The oak log platforms are a similar case. They are described with specificity, hewn timber fitted into the shaft walls at regular intervals. The regularity is the important detail. Platforms found at 10, 20, and 30 feet by the first diggers, and continuing at the same intervals through the Onslow Company's work, suggest a single planned construction with a consistent design logic. They were not placed as the shaft was dug in one continuous operation by a single group of workers who were learning the dimensions as they went. They were placed to a plan. The scale of the planned construction is part of what the accounts document, and it is worth resting in for a moment. A shaft 4 meters across, timbered at every 10 feet, with fitted oak platforms extending to at least 90 feet depth by the Onslow Company's reckoning, which stopped at the flooding event and protected by a hydraulic system that drew tidal ocean water through an unknown route from a beach approximately 150 meters away. The volume of material removed to create that shaft, the engineering required to build and install the timber platforms without collapsing the shaft walls during construction, the logistics of the hydraulic protection system, its design, its tunneling, its beach filtration structure, and the labor required to build it in a remote tidal island location in an era before mechanized excavation. Whoever built this had resources. Whoever built this had technical capability. Whoever built this also presumably had a reason to go to this particular expense and effort in this particular location, and that reason, which the pit's contents would presumably explain, sat at the bottom of the flooded shaft, below the reach of every tool that the early 19th century brought to the problem. The Onslow Company left the pit full of water and did not return. The investment had been made, the labor had been performed, the bottom had not been reached. That is the shape of the first formal organized excavation of the money pit, and it established a pattern that the site would repeat with variations across many successive generations of investors, engineers, and equipment. The pattern of approaching, descending, encountering the water, and being stopped. The water in the flooded shaft that the Onslow Company left behind was not standing water in the ordinary sense. It was not a puddle that had collected in a sealed hole and would slowly evaporate or drain. It was connected to the beach, connected to the tidal sea. It breathed with the ocean's breath, rising and falling in the slow rhythm of the Atlantic tides. As it had breathed on the morning the workers arrived to find the pit flooded, and as it would continue to breathe through the seasons and the years and the decades that followed. The oak tree stood at the edge of the shaft mouth, its worn branch extending over the empty center. The flagstones were somewhere in the disturbed earth nearby. The hewn log platforms remained in their positions at regular intervals down the shaft's interior walls, in the dark below the waterline, the timber presumably unchanged by immersion, the positions they had occupied since someone fitted them there, still occupied, the plan they had been built to still legible in their arrangement. The coconut fiber sat at 60 feet, compressed and porous, doing whatever it had been placed to do in the original construction, functioning now only in the presence of the water that surrounded it. The water stayed, the seasons moved, the tides continued their schedule. The pit sat in the forest on Oak Island's eastern end, and the water inside it held its level at approximately 60 feet below ground, and the inscribed stone was somewhere in Halifax, and Daniel McGinnis was aging, and the story of what three teenagers found in the summer of 1795 was passing from mouth to mouth through the communities of Nova Scotia's South Shore, carrying its unanswered questions forward into a future that would prove considerably more interested in the problem than the Onslow Company's investors had been able to sustain. The first organized excavation of the money pit ended without resolution. The record of it was assembled in the form in which it now survives, from accounts composed years and decades after the work was done. The central physical evidence, the timbered shaft, the exotic deposits, the flooded connection to the sea was real, in the sense that multiple independent accounts describe it consistently, in the sense that later excavations would confirm some of its features, and in the sense that the flooding mechanism, whatever its precise engineering, continues to function to this day. That last fact is the one the record confirms most clearly of all. The pit has been flooded since the morning the Onslow Company workers arrived and found the water sitting at 60 feet. Every subsequent excavation has confronted the same condition. The water that defeated the hand pump in approximately 1804 has not gone anywhere. It has stayed in the pit, synchronizing its level to the ocean's tides, keeping its slow, patient time through 2 centuries and more of attempts to remove it, to redirect it, to seal the tunnels that carry it, to pump it faster than it enters. The shaft is still flooded, the rhythm is still running, the circular mouth of the pit at ground level, the dark water visible below it at 60 feet, the surface of the water barely moving, rising a fraction with the incoming tide, settling back with the ebb. That image from the morning of the Onslow Company's last successful day at the site is not a historical image in the sense of being past. The water is still there. The tide is still the tide. Whatever was placed in the shaft below the waterline, placed there with hewn oak platforms and coconut fiber and an inscribed stone and a flood system built to protect it, has remained in that position through all the years the record documents and through all the years before the record begins. The water sits still and dark inside the pit, rising and falling in its slow, unhurried rhythm, and it has been keeping that rhythm without interruption for more than 200 years. The morning the Onslow Company workers arrived at the pit, the water was already there. It sat in the shaft at approximately 60 feet below the surface, dark, still, and level, a disk of calm water where the previous day there had been only damp timber and gray glacial soil. Someone had lit a lantern and held it over the pit mouth. The flame would have stretched slightly in the cold Atlantic air coming off the bay, and the water below would have caught the light and returned it in a slow, shifting oval on the shaft walls. No one who was present that morning left a written account of what they said. What the record preserves is simply the fact: the pit was flooded, the water was at 60 feet, and there was nothing the Onslow Company's equipment could do about it. That was somewhere around 1804, and the water has not left since. The interval between the flooding of the Onslow shaft and the present day is more than 2 centuries, and across that full span of time, through every pump and every drill and every improved dewatering system the following 200 years of engineering could provide, the water in the money pit has remained essentially where it settled that morning. It rises and falls. It is obedient to the tide in a way that a natural groundwater table, responding to seasonal and atmospheric pressure, would not be. The synchronization is precise enough that by the time systematic measurements were being made, the water surface inside the pit and the tidal predictions printed on the Nova Scotia tide tables matched within an acceptable margin. one pulled by the moon, the other enclosed in timber and soil, and both moving to the same schedule. The question the record cannot fully answer is how. The prevailing theory, which has been refined and argued over for more than a century without achieving universal acceptance, holds that one or more artificial tunnels connect the main shaft to Smith's Cove, a tidal beach on the eastern shore of the island, approximately 150 meters away. The theory proposes that whoever constructed the original pit designed the tunnel system so that any excavation reaching a critical depth would breach a cavity and allow seawater to flood the shaft under tidal pressure at a volume and rate that would exceed any practical pump's capacity to remove it. The design, if it is a design, would represent a hydraulic security system of considerable sophistication, one built entirely from available materials, requiring no mechanism to maintain, and one that has continued operating without any known maintenance for as long as the records describe the site. That last quality is what serious investigators return to, again and again, when they attempt to assess the theory honestly. A mechanism that continues to function for 2 centuries in saltwater conditions without repair is either extraordinarily well built or something simpler than a mechanism, a natural feature that happens to behave like one. The geological skeptics have made exactly this argument, and it carries genuine weight. Nova Scotia's geology includes karst features and glacial formations that can produce complex subsurface drainage patterns, and the tidal sensitivity of the pit's water level is not, on its own, definitive evidence of artificial construction. Tidal influence on coastal groundwater tables is documented and well understood. What the geological explanation has difficulty accounting for is the coconut fiber. In 1850, a group called the Truro Company was excavating Smith's Cove, the tidal beach believed to be the flood tunnel's ocean terminus, when their workers removed the uppermost layer of beach surface and discovered something beneath it that did not belong there. The material was organized beneath the ordinary-looking sand and gravel of the cove's beach. Workers described finding alternating layers of coconut fiber and eelgrass arranged in a flat horizontal mat extending across an area estimated at roughly 145 feet wide. The layers were distinct and deliberate, not mixed or jumbled in the way that organic debris accumulates naturally, but placed in sequence, one atop the other, in a pattern consistent with a water filtration system designed to allow tidal water to percolate through, while trapping particulate matter that might otherwise clog the passages below. Coconut palms do not grow in Nova Scotia. They have not grown there during any climatic period relevant to the pit's likely construction date. The fiber in the Smith's Cove filtration layer must have arrived by ship, transported from a tropical or subtropical region where the coconut palm is native. The Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, South Asia, West Africa, any of these origins would require a deliberate voyage, a deliberate cargo decision, and a deliberate application of the material to a specific engineering problem at a specific site. The coconut fiber is not impossible to explain by natural processes entirely, but the explanation becomes increasingly strained when the fiber is found arranged in horizontal alternating layers beneath the beach surface of a cove, believed to connect hydraulically with a shaft that has been resisting excavation for over 200 years. The Truro Company noted the material, removed some of it for examination, and continued digging. What they found next, when the upper beach layers were cleared, was the fan drain system beneath the filtration mat, cutting down through the beach sediment toward the presumed inlet of the flood tunnel. Excavators described a network of stone-lined drainage channels radiating outward from a central collection point in a pattern variously described as fan-shaped or resembling an open hand. The channels were not natural fractures in the bedrock. They were lined. The stones forming their walls were placed, fitted against each other, in the manner of deliberate masonry, rather than the random stacking that freeze-thaw cycles produce in coastal geology. Different excavation teams over successive decades have estimated the number of individual channels at between 5 and 12, which is a wide range, but the uncertainty speaks more to the difficulty of excavating a tidal beach, where every low tide opens a brief window before the water returns, than to any fundamental disagreement about the existence of the structure. The function the channels served in the theory of artificial construction is straightforward. A flood tunnel requiring a sustained flow of tidal water needs a reliable inlet, not a single pipe or aperture that might become silted and blocked, but a dispersed collection system that gathers water across the full width of the beach and directs it inward from many points simultaneously. The fan drain geometry accomplishes exactly this. Each channel collects water from a section of the beach, and all channels direct their flow toward a central trunk that carries the water down toward the tunnel. The filtration mat above prevents fine sediment from entering the channels and progressively blocking them. The system, considered as a designed object, is not complex. It requires only stone, labor, and an understanding of basic hydrology to build. But it would have required planning, and it would have required whoever built it to intend the outcome. It is worth sitting with the word intend for a moment, because the record is genuinely careful about this. The stone-lined channels were observed by excavators. The coconut fiber layers were observed by excavators. The tidal synchronization of the pit's water level was measured by later investigators with instruments precise enough to confirm the correspondence. None of these three observations, considered individually, constitutes proof of artificial construction. The channels might be unusual, but natural geological features. The coconut fiber might have arrived by some mechanism not yet proposed. The tidal synchronization might be a property of the natural groundwater table that only appears intentional when the human desire to find meaning is brought to bear on it. Geological skeptics hold these positions with genuine scholarly credibility, and they are not easily dismissed. What is harder to dismiss is all three observations together, in the same location, in a configuration that matches the theoretical design of a hydraulic security system, closely enough to be repeatedly cited by engineers reviewing the site. The specific evidence of the flooding at the Onslow shaft deserves careful attention in its own right, because the sequence of events around that flooding is itself informative. The workers arrived in the morning, found the water at 60 feet, and immediately attempted to remove it. The method available to them was a hand pump assisted by a bucket chain, the standard dewatering technology of a Nova Scotia construction site in the early 19th century, and wholly adequate for managing ordinary groundwater infiltration in a shallow excavation. The pump ran, the buckets moved, the water did not go down. The rate of inflow appears to have been substantially greater than the rate of outflow the pump and bucket chain could achieve. That relationship between the volume of water entering the pit and the volume any practical pump of the period could remove has held across every subsequent attempt to dewater the shaft. The Onslow Company gave up. The Truro Company gave up. A series of increasingly mechanically sophisticated operations across the 19th and 20th centuries reached the same outcome. The water came in faster than it could be pumped out, and whatever was below the water remained below the water. The boiler-powered pump introduced in the 1860s could move water at a volume no hand pump approached, and it still could not win the contest. The rate of inflow simply increased to meet it. This is consistent with the behavior of a tidal system. If the flood tunnel is connected to the sea, the pressure driving water into the shaft is not a fixed reservoir being gradually depleted, but a tidal body whose volume is effectively unlimited within the timescale of any pumping operation. A sealed finite underground chamber, even a large one, can be pumped dry if the pump is sufficiently powerful and the chamber walls are sufficiently intact. The money pit has never behaved like a finite chamber. It has always behaved like a passage. The coconut fiber layer at Smith's Cove requires a small digression into maritime history, because understanding what it represents requires understanding what it is and where it could have come from. Coconut husks, when dried, produce a fibrous material called coir, which has been used for rope making, matting, and packing material across maritime cultures for several thousand years. Ships crossing the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries commonly carried coir, or raw coconut fiber, as packing material or ballast, acquiring it at Caribbean or West African ports. The presence of coconut fiber on an island off the coast of Nova Scotia in a geological stratum consistent with the likely construction period of the money pit is in itself not impossible for a maritime trading or privateering culture. Ships arrived in Nova Scotia carrying all manner of tropical material. What makes the Smith's Cove fiber unusual is not its presence on the island, it is its organization. A layer of coconut fiber beneath the beach, arranged in alternating bands with eel grass, covering an estimated 145 feet of beach width, is not the random accumulation of ship ballast. It is a placed structure. The argument that it arrived by accident and then arranged itself into a filtration system by natural processes requires a sequence of improbable events, while the argument that it was placed deliberately requires only the assumption that whoever built the flood system understood what they were doing. The eelgrass itself, present in the alternating layers, is native to Nova Scotia's coastal environment. It grows in the bay and along the island's shores. Its inclusion in the filtration mat would require only the knowledge that it is available and the labor to cut and place it. The coconut fiber would require a connection to a supply chain that included tropical sources or access to ship stores that included coir packing. Neither requirement is implausible for any reasonably well-equipped maritime operation of the 17th or 18th century, but both requirements together suggest an operation with resources and planning rather than an improvised burial. Subsequent excavations at Smith's Cove, conducted by various teams across the 20th century and into the 21st, have produced a fragmented picture of the fan drain system because the tidal environment makes sustained, systematic excavation at the cove extremely difficult. The window between tides at the cove is narrow. The sediment is saturated and unstable when exposed. Heavy machinery brought to the cove to accelerate excavation has repeatedly disturbed the very structures it was intended to expose, and the record of exactly what has been found, by whom, at what depth, in what configuration, is less precise than investigators would prefer. What survives across the various accounts is the consistent identification of stone-lined channel structures, described independently by excavation teams who had no reason to agree with each other if they were not observing the same thing. The tunnel itself, the principal element of the flood system theory, the passage connecting the Smith's Cove inlet to the money pit shaft, has never been located with certainty, and this is the most significant gap in the physical evidence. What would constitute definitive proof of artificial construction would be the discovery of a stone-lined or timber-lined tunnel running from beneath the Smith's Cove filtration system toward the pit at the appropriate depth, with dimensions inconsistent with natural fracture or glacial drainage. No excavation has found this tunnel in a form that has achieved universal acceptance, though several teams over the years have reported what they described as tunnel-like passages at various depths in the relevant area. The difficulty is geological as well as practical. The island's subsurface, between Smith's Cove and the Money Pit, is a complex environment of glacial till, bedrock, and permeable formation, distinguishing an artificial passage from a natural void in that environment at depth through saturated soil, using the drilling and probing technology of the 19th or early 20th century, was genuinely difficult. Even with modern ground-penetrating radar and borehole cameras, the precise path of any connecting tunnel has not been mapped with certainty. What has been mapped with greater confidence is the behavior of the water itself. A dye test conducted by one investigation team involved introducing tracer dye into the flooded shaft and monitoring multiple locations around the island's perimeter for its emergence. The dye was subsequently detected at Smith's Cove and at one other coastal location on the island's Atlantic-facing shore, establishing hydraulic connections between the pit and at least 2 external ocean access points. The dye test does not prove artificial construction. Natural karst passages could produce the same result, but it does confirm that the pit is hydraulically connected to the sea at multiple points, and that the drainage patterns are more complex than a single tunnel from a single inlet could explain. This finding, reported in the latter half of the 20th century, significantly complicated the prevailing theory of the flood system by suggesting that the system may have more than one component, possibly a primary tunnel from Smith's Cove combined with secondary channels or naturally assisted passages from the southern shore, an artificial flood system augmented by natural geology, or a natural drainage pattern supplemented by artificial engineering would be difficult to distinguish from the surface and difficult to defeat with any dewatering strategy short of blocking all the inlets simultaneously. No excavation has yet succeeded in blocking all the inlets simultaneously, in part because all of the inlets have not yet been identified. There is a quality to this problem that is worth pausing on in a quiet way, because it is the quality that has held the attention of investigators across 2 centuries and across substantial differences in their resources and equipment. The problem is not simply that something is buried and water is in the way. The problem is that the water itself appears to be part of the design. A treasure pit, if that is what the Money Pit is, that floods on its own when excavated, is a passive security system of remarkable elegance. It requires no guardian, no lock, no mechanism to maintain or repair. It requires only that the engineering be sound enough to survive the interval between burial and attempted recovery, and the interval has now extended beyond 200 years, during which the pit's hydraulic connection to the Atlantic has continued undisturbed. The coconut fiber filtration mat is the physical element of the system that receives the least attention in popular accounts and deserves considerably more. The mat's function in the context of the flood system is not ornamental. A fan drain system collecting tidal water from a beach would, without filtration, progressively fill its channels with fine sand and organic sediment suspended in the incoming water. Over time, unfiltered channels would silt up and the flow would diminish. The filtration mat prevents this. It allows water to percolate through while trapping the particles that would otherwise clog the system, extending the operational life of the drain channels indefinitely, or at least for a period measured in centuries rather than years. This is maintenance-free engineering. The mat was placed once. It has continued to perform its filtration function for as long as the flood system has been operational. The person or group that designed and built this system was not thinking about the immediate problem of concealing something from searchers who might arrive within the decade. They were thinking about concealment across an interval long enough to require a system that would keep itself functional without any further attention. That level of forward planning implies either considerable experience with long-term concealment or a sufficiently specific reason to expect a very long delay before any intended recovery. The eelgrass in the alternating layers is another detail that rewards attention for the same reason. Eelgrass as a local material available in quantity along Nova Scotia's shores would have been an obvious choice for anyone building a filtration system who understood the basic principle. The inclusion of an available local material alongside a transported tropical material in a two-component filtration design suggests a builder who was working with deliberate knowledge of what the system needed to do, rather than simply burying something beneath beach debris and hoping it would serve. The dye test results identifying Smith's Cove as one hydraulic connection point and a second location on the southern shore, as another has led some researchers to propose that the pit was designed with redundant and pre-flood inlets, that the original construction included two or more separate flood sources so that blocking one would not defeat the system. This is a more sophisticated level of engineering still. Redundant systems are not built by accident. They are built by people who have considered failure modes, who have asked what happens if the first mechanism is defeated, and who have designed a second mechanism to address that outcome. The evidence for a second flood inlet is real, but incomplete. The dye emerged at 2 points. The interpretation that this confirms two designed inlets rather than one designed inlet and one natural connection has not been resolved, and the distinction matters for any future excavation strategy because the answer changes what it would take to successfully dewater the pit. What later excavation teams have done, working with modern survey technology, is begin to map the subsurface of the island in ways that were not previously possible. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies at depths and locations consistent with the proposed flood tunnel route between Smith's Cove and the Money Pit shaft. These anomalies are not definitively tunnels. The technology returns density contrast rather than visual images, and a tunnel-shaped void and a naturally occurring karst passage would produce similar signatures. But the surveys have moved the conversation from pure inference based on surface observation and flood behavior towards something that can, in principle, be tested by directed excavation. The directed excavation, when it arrives at the relevant location, still has to contend with the water. This is the circle that every investigation of the flood system ultimately closes. The evidence that the tunnel exists is largely behavioral. The flooding, the tidal synchronization, the dye test results, and the behavioral evidence, while consistent and persistent, cannot be physically confirmed without entering the flooded space. Entering the flooded space requires dewatering it. Dewatering it requires blocking the inlets. Blocking the inlets requires locating them with precision. Locating them with precision requires the kind of sustained excavation and survey work that the tidal environment at Smith's Cove has repeatedly resisted. The instruments have become better. The surveys have become more detailed. The maps of what lies beneath the island's surface are more complete now than at any previous point in the investigation's history. But the water remains at its tidal level, and the fan drains, if they are what the excavation records describe, continue to collect the Atlantic's tidal flow and direct it into whatever passage leads to the shaft. A tidal gauge installed near the Money Pit by a later investigation team recorded the surface of the water in the shaft across a full tidal cycle. The needle of the gauge moved in its slow, patient arc, rising as the tide came in across Mahoney Bay, falling as the tide retreated, rising again, falling again, completing its cycle in the familiar interval of approximately 12 hours and 25 minutes that governs the Atlantic coast's semi-diurnal tidal pattern. The tide table for the Nova Scotia coast, printed and updated each year by the Canadian Hydrographic Service, gives the predicted heights and times of each high and low tide at reference stations across the province. The water surface in the Money Pit has been tracking something close to those predictions. Not exactly, because the pit's connection to the open sea is indirect and subject to geological resistance and lag, but close enough that the correspondence is unmistakable once it is measured. Whatever the water is doing, it is not doing it randomly. It is doing it in response to the moon's gravitational pull on the Atlantic Ocean, transmitted through a passage of some kind in the island's subsurface, arriving in the shaft with a timing that the filtration mat and drain channels and any tunnel between them have been maintaining without interruption for as long as the site has been observed. The tidal gauge's needle rises. The gap between the water surface and the pit mouth narrows by a few centimeters. Then the tide turns somewhere offshore, and the needle begins its descent again. Whatever was placed below the water, whether the pit is empty, whether it contains what the early accounts suggest, or something entirely different, whether it was built by the hands and minds that the various theories propose, it sits in tidal time. The Atlantic comes in around it. The Atlantic retreats. The Atlantic comes in again. The needle moves in its slow arc, recording what the sea has been doing to the island every 12 hours and 25 minutes, through summer and winter, through the construction of the causeway in 1965, through every season of excavation and every season of abandonment, through the full interval of more than 2 centuries that separates the morning. The Onslow Company found their flooded shaft from the present, quiet moment when the gauge is still mounted on its wooden post and the water is still inside the pit and the tide is still keeping its patient, undivided time. The fan drains at Smith's Cove, if they are intact beneath the disturbed beach sediment, or still doing what the coconut fiber mat was laid to help them do, collecting the incoming tide across the width of the cove, filtering it through alternating layers of fiber and grass, and directing it down through whatever passage connects the beach to the shaft. The passage, still unmapped with certainty, still carries the water through in the way it has always carried it through. The shaft receives what the passage sends. The tidal gauge records what the shaft receives. The needle moves in its slow, patient arc, as it has moved through every tide since the instrument was placed there, keeping perfect time with an ocean that asks nothing of the pit and gives nothing up, simply continuing to rise and fall, the way it will continue to rise and fall long after the last investigation team has packed its equipment and driven back across the causeway, and the island sits again in the November quiet of Mahoney Bay, its low dark tree line visible from the water, the tidal flat on either side running out to gray, and somewhere beneath the surface of the eastern end, the water doing what it has always done, holding its level, keeping its time, patient in the way that tidal systems are patient, which is to say, without any patience at all, because patience implies waiting, and the water is not waiting for anything. It simply rises and falls and rises again. The iron pod auger bit was approximately 3 inches in diameter at its tip. It descended through the wooden frame built over the money pit shaft in the summer of 1849, turned by a mechanism The Truro Company had assembled from timber and iron, and the labor of men who had come to Nova Scotia from across the northeastern seaboard on the reasonable expectation that what lay below them was worth the cost of getting to it. The drill rotated slowly. The drillers listened for the change in resistance that would signal a transition from one material to the next, because in a shaft they could no longer safely enter. The bit and the sound it made and the material it brought up were all the information they had. At approximately 98 feet, the resistance changed. The bit passed through what the drillers recorded as a spruce platform, wood, horizontal, fitted across the shaft as the earlier platforms had been fitted at shallower depths. Then it passed through a void. Then it encountered resistance again, and the material that came back up the drill core was described as soft and loose, unlike the packed clay and timber they had been drilling through for hours. The drillers estimated they had passed through roughly 22 inches of this softer material before the bit met resistance again, and when they examined what the auger had returned to the surface, some of it appeared to be metal, small, loose pieces of something that was not soil, or wood or stone. The company's records described the sequence as consistent with wooden chests containing coin or bullion, the spruce lid of the uppermost chest giving way under the drill and the contents shifting and compressing around the bit before it passed through into whatever lay below. That was the interpretation. The auger sample itself did not confirm it. The material was suggestive, the inference was reasonable given what they had found, and the company would spend the rest of its operational life unable to get back to it. The flooding that stopped the Onslow Company's excavation years earlier had not been solved. Water still entered the shaft at depth, still rose and fell with the tides, and still outpaced every pump the Truro Company could bring to bear on it. The pod auger represented a way around the water, a method of reaching below the flood line without removing the water first, of making contact with what lay below through the thinnest possible instrument, rather than through direct excavation. It was an elegant response to a hydraulic problem that had already defeated one organized company and would go on to defeat many more. The auger could reach the depth. It could bring back material. What it could not do was remove whatever it found, confirm the interpretation, or answer the question the drillers carried with them every day they worked the shaft. The Truro Company dissolved without recovering what the drill had touched. The records they left behind, the depth figures, the material descriptions, the sequence of spruce and void and loose metal became part of the foundational documentary case for something buried deliberately below the floodline of the money pit, cited by every subsequent excavation team that attempted to reach the same depth. The bit itself was eventually lost, like most of the physical evidence from the island's earlier excavations. What remained was the written account, and the account has been read by every serious investigator since. The year 1861 brought a different kind of operation to the island. The Oak Island Association had assembled sufficient capital to attempt a steam-powered dewatering operation, a meaningful technological step beyond the bucket chains and hand pumps of earlier companies, designed to address the flooding problem directly rather than to work around it. A steam boiler was brought to the site, connected to pumps, and put to work drawing water from the main shaft. The operation ran for some time before the boiler burst. One worker was killed, and others were injured in the explosion. Later that same year, the bottom of the main shaft collapsed, a structural failure believed to have been caused by years of partial flooding, creating an underground cavity that eventually gave way under the weight of the earth above it. The collapse permanently altered the geometry of the lower shaft. The depths that the Truro Company's auger had reached in 1849 were now beneath a different configuration of soil and broken timber. The reference points scrambled. The approach to whatever lay at the bottom of the pit made significantly more complicated than it had already been. The association's operation ended without resolving either the hydraulic problem or the structural one. What it had done, through the boiler failure and the shaft collapse, was leave the site in a condition more difficult to excavate than the one it had inherited. This was the pattern that would repeat across the following century and a half, each new operation arriving with greater resources, greater confidence, and greater technical capability than the one before it, and each one departing, having spent substantially more than it recovered, and having made the problem, in at least some respects, harder for the next arrival. The island waited. Franklin Roosevelt was 27 years old in the summer of 1909 when he traveled to Nova Scotia as a participant in the Old Gold Salvage Group's excavation of Oak Island. He was not yet a lawyer, not yet an elected official, not yet any of the things that would eventually make his name a fact in every American's education. He was a young man of some inherited means and considerable personal energy who had read about the island and decided to go. The expedition employed a crew, used a pump, and worked the site through the warm weeks of a Nova Scotia summer. The Old Gold Salvage Group did not find treasure. The operation ran through its available capital, encountered the same flooding problems that had ended every prior effort, and dissolved as prior companies had dissolved, without confirmed recovery. Roosevelt, by most accounts, did not lose interest in the island when the expedition ended. Reports from people who knew him across the following decades indicate that he continued to follow news of Oak Island's successive excavations with genuine personal attention, that the question of what lay below the waterline remained, for him, a live question rather than a settled disappointment. He would go on to hold offices whose demands left little room for the kind of obsessive focus the island seemed to require of those it captured most fully. His connection to the place remained the connection of a participant who knew what the site felt like from the ground and who had never stopped wondering what the drill cores from 1849 had actually touched. The Old Gold Salvage Group's records from 1909 are sparse. Photographs from the expedition survive, including some that show Roosevelt among the crew on the island's surface, the flat terrain behind him, the excavation equipment arranged near the pit mouth. He appears as one figure among several in the flat gray light of a summer morning, the island looking exactly as it looks in every other photograph taken there across 2 centuries, low, heavily treed, unremarkable from any distance. Nothing in the photographs identifies the location as a place that had already absorbed decades of organized human effort and substantial capital without yielding a single confirmed piece of the original deposit. The island waited, and different people came to it. Between Roosevelt's 1909 summer and the next major transformation in how the island was approached, several smaller excavation efforts came and went. The site changed hands. Treasure rights were bought and sold. The documentary record thins across certain periods, picks up again when a new company registers or a newspaper runs an account of a fresh dig, then thins again. The island itself did not change in ways that were recorded. The water below the floodline rose and fell with the tides. The upper soil layers, disturbed and redistributed by more than a century of prior digging, settled into configurations that made the original stratigraphy increasingly difficult to reconstruct. The shaft that Daniel McGinnis had begun digging in 1795 was now a complicated palimpsest of prior excavations, widened, collapsed, refilled, widened again, and the exact location of what the Truro Company's auger had reached in 1849 was no longer something a surveyor could pinpoint with confidence. Then, in 1965, a magazine article changed the trajectory of one person's life completely. Dan Blankenship was a contractor living in Miami when he read an account of Oak Island in Reader's Digest. The article described the history of the excavations, the evidence for artificial construction, the long series of failed attempts to reach whatever lay below the floodline. Blankenship read it with the attention of someone for whom the material was not recreational, not the mild curiosity of a commuter passing time, but the focused engagement of a person encountering a problem that matched something in his temperament. He was a practical man. He built things. He understood construction and materials and the kind of engineering that leaves physical evidence in the ground. The account of the flood tunnel system, the coconut fiber filtration layer, the fan drain geometry exposed at Smith's Cove, these were not the elements of a legend. They were the elements of an engineering problem. Blankenship investigated the island with increasing seriousness over the following years, eventually making the decision to move his family from Miami to Nova Scotia and establish a permanent presence on Oak Island. The relocation was not a temporary arrangement. He moved to the island itself, built a house there, and settled into the kind of long-form, daily contact investigation that no seasonal expedition could replicate. He knew the terrain in every season. He knew how the flooding behaved in winter, how the soil responded to different equipment in different weather, where prior excavations had left the ground unstable and where it remained undisturbed. He accumulated the knowledge that accumulates only through years of physical presence in a specific place. Through the early 1970s, Blankenship partnered with David Tobias, a Toronto businessman who shared his conviction that the island contained something worth the sustained effort of reaching it. Together they formed the Triton Alliance, pooled their resources, and began an excavation program more systematically organized than most of what had preceded it. The Triton Alliance brought in professional drilling equipment and employed it methodically across the island, mapping the subsurface rather than simply driving toward the known center of prior activity. One of the boreholes drilled by the Triton Alliance was designated 10X. It was located some distance from the main money pit shaft, drilled to a depth that eventually exceeded 200 feet, and cased with steel as it descended. In 1971, an underwater camera was lowered through the steel casing of borehole 10X into the water that filled its lower reaches. The camera was a low-light unit, the kind used in early industrial inspection, a technology that was functional but limited, capable of producing images in which shapes could be distinguished, but fine detail was difficult to resolve. The footage captured was dark, as underwater footage in enclosed spaces tends to be, and what it showed was disputed by everyone who watched it. Some of those present, including Blankenship himself, believed the footage showed an underground chamber. They believed, watching the footage in the conditions under which it was captured, that certain shapes visible at the edge of the image's resolution were consistent with chests, rectangular forms, arranged as stored containers might be arranged. They believed other shapes in the footage were consistent with tools. One interpretation, advanced by at least one participant who examined the footage carefully, was that a shape visible near the bottom of the frame was consistent with a human hand, severed from a body, settled on the floor of the chamber. The footage quality was poor. The shapes were indistinct. The interpretations were made by people who were already deeply committed to the belief that something had been placed in the ground beneath Oak Island at considerable effort, and who had spent years or decades working toward the moment of confirmation. The footage has never been confirmed as showing what the most optimistic interpretations proposed. Subsequent attempts to enter the cavity indicated by borehole 10X to lower a diver through the casing, to excavate toward the chamber from a different angle, were complicated by ongoing flooding, by the structural instability of the ground at depth, and by the practical limits of what could be accomplished at 200 feet below the surface in a water-filled borehole in a tidal zone. The camera went down, the footage came back, the shapes remained shapes, the interpretations remained interpretations, available to anyone who watched the footage and open to dispute by anyone who watched it equally carefully and saw something less conclusive. Blankenship continued working on the island into the 1990s and beyond. The Triton Alliance eventually ran into financial and legal difficulties. The partnership between Blankenship and Tobias, strained by the weight of years without confirmed recovery, and the cost of sustaining an operation on an island that gave nothing back in the conventional sense. Tobias eventually moved towards selling his interest in the treasure rights. Blankenship remained on the island in his house, continuing to work. He had been there for decades by then. The question of what lay below the waterline was not, for him, a hobby or an investment thesis. It was a life's work, and the specific texture of that work, its physical dailiness, its accumulation of small observations and inconclusive findings, was the only context in which the question made complete sense. In 2006, Rick Legina and his brother Marty Legina purchased a majority stake in Oak Island's treasure rights from the Triton Alliance's successors. The Legina brothers came from Michigan. Rick was the elder, and by most accounts the one whose engagement with Oak Island had the longer history. He had read about the island as a young man and had carried the question of it through the intervening decades in the way that certain questions attach themselves to certain temperaments and simply do not release. Marty was a businessman and engineer, the kind of person whose instinct when confronting a complicated problem is to assemble the best available tools and people and apply them systematically. The purchase of the treasure rights gave the Leginas access to the island that prior investigators had negotiated with successive owners across 2 centuries. They began an excavation program that differed from its predecessors, not in the intensity of the central question, what is below the waterline, who put it there, and when, but in the range of methods brought to bear on answering it. Where earlier companies had relied on hand tools, then steam equipment, then increasingly capable drilling apparatus, the Leginas brought in ground-penetrating radar, which could map subsurface anomalies without breaking the ground. They brought in LiDAR scanning, which could produce precise 3-dimensional models of the island's terrain and the structures beneath it. They commissioned dendrochronology on recovered timber samples, the science of tree ring dating, which could establish when a piece of wood had been felled with considerable precision. They employed professional archaeologists who worked to the standards of academic excavation, documenting the stratigraphy of each dig with the care of people who understood that the island's accumulated disturbance made context as important as artifact. In January 2014, the History Channel broadcast the first episode of a docu-series following the Legina brothers' excavation work on Oak Island. The series ran into multiple seasons, and then continued past multiple seasons, and then continued further, eventually reaching and then exceeding 10 seasons of episodes, each one following the accumulation of small finds, technological surveys, and incremental progress that characterized the brothers' methodical approach. The audience for the series was by any measure large. The island had absorbed the attention of individual investigators and small companies for more than 2 centuries, and had now attracted the sustained attention of a network television audience that returned season after season to watch the question remain open. The ground-penetrating radar surveys produced images of the subsurface that no prior investigation had been able to generate. Anomalies appeared at various depths across the eastern end of the island, shapes inconsistent with natural geology, voids that were not glacial, structures that suggested chambers or passages arranged with a geometry that the surrounding soil did not exhibit. The LiDAR scans produced surface models that revealed features of the terrain, slight depressions, geometric regularities in the distribution of certain plant species, variations in the drainage pattern that were difficult to interpret but equally difficult to attribute entirely to natural processes. The dendrochronology of timber samples recovered from various excavation points produced dates. Wood recovered from the flood tunnel system at Smith's Cove returned dates consistent with the 17th and 18th centuries, a range that neither confirmed nor excluded any of the major theories about who had constructed the hydraulic system. But that placed the construction firmly within the period of European activity in the region, ruling out pre-Columbian origin theories for at least the visible tunnel infrastructure. The archaeologists documented their findings methodically, recording the context of each recovered fragment, the depth and orientation of each sample, the stratigraphy of the surrounding soil, in terms that would allow subsequent investigators to understand what had been found and where. The central mystery remained unresolved. The money pit shaft, or rather, the complicated system of disturbed and partially collapsed ground that represented the accumulated result of more than 2 centuries of digging on and around the original discovery point, was still flooded below the water table and still inaccessible to direct physical inspection. Whatever the Truro Company's auger had touched in 1849, at approximately 98 to 100 feet depth, was still somewhere below that water line, in a configuration that 2 centuries of subsequent digging, collapsing, pumping, and drilling had significantly altered from the original arrangement. If there had been an original arrangement, if the auger had touched what the drillers believed it had touched. The question of what, precisely, the modern surveys had found was not simple to answer. The anomalies recorded by the ground-penetrating radar were real anomalies. That is, they were genuine departures from the surrounding geology, recorded by the instrument and reproducible across multiple survey passes. What they represented was less clear. A void at a certain depth and geometry might be an artificial chamber. It might also be a natural dissolution feature in the local limestone, of the kind that geological skeptics had long proposed as an explanation for some portion of the flooding. A rectangular anomaly might be a buried chest, or a timber beam, or a collapsed section of prior excavation. The instrument records the departure from baseline. It does not identify the cause. The LiDAR scan printout spread across the site table, a large sheet of paper showing the island's subsurface as a grid of color-coded anomalies, each departure from natural baseline indicated by a shift in the color scale, the whole picture representing the most comprehensive image of what lay beneath Oak Island that any investigation had ever produced. Was an extraordinary document in the history of the island's excavation. Every prior team had been working, in some sense, blind. They knew where the original shaft had been sunk. They knew approximately the depth at which flooding occurred. They knew what the auger cores had returned. They did not have a complete picture of what the ground beneath the island contained. The Laginas had that picture. It was incomplete in the way that all pictures produced by indirect measurement are incomplete. The color-coded anomalies, indicating departures from baseline without specifying what caused them, the void shapes suggesting chambers without confirming their contents, the geometric patterns in the drainage suggesting artificial construction without identifying its builders. But it was a picture of the whole, and no prior team had had that. Every anomaly on the scan represented a decision point, a place where the ground departed from what the surrounding geology predicted, and where the departure was significant enough that a trained geophysicist had judged it worth marking on the printed sheet. The island had been mapped in a way it had never been mapped before. The question that the map raised was the same question every excavation had raised since Daniel McGinnis stood at the edge of the depression in 1795. Something was down there. The evidence for deliberate construction, the hewn platforms, the coconut fiber filtration system, the fan drain geometry at Smith's Cove, the fragment of parchment recovered from a drill core at 153 feet, the tidal synchronization of the flooding was not the kind of evidence that accumulated by accident across 2 centuries of independent investigation by parties with no coordinated interest in producing a consistent story. The evidence was real. The construction was real. What lay below the waterline, what the auger had touched, what the 10x camera had filmed in the dark water of an underground chamber in 1971, that remained exactly where it had been when the Onslow Company's shaft flooded sometime around 1804, and the water rose and settled and began its patient, tidal, unbroken vigil. Dan Blankenship, who had read a magazine article in Miami in 1965 and moved his family to Oak Island and spent the better part of his adult life working the ground there, died in 2019. He was 95 years old. He had lived on the island for more than 50 years. In that time, he had watched every subsequent excavation team arrive, work the ground, spend its money, and confront the same hydraulic problem that had stopped the Onslow Company in 1804, and every company after it. He had watched technology improve from steam pumps to electric pumps to ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, and had seen each new instrument produce new information without producing the answer. He had watched the Legina brothers arrive with their television cameras and their professional archaeologists and their systematic program and their audience of millions, and he had been present for the anomalies the radar and LiDAR produced, and he had died without knowing what those anomalies contained. His life on the island was, in the documentary record, one of the more complete examples of what Oak Island does to the people it captures most fully. It does not release them. It does not offer the partial confirmation that would allow a person to say the question is probably answered and move on. It offers instead the continuous accumulation of suggestive evidence, the material that is tropical, the parchment that was written on and deliberately buried, the construction that required significant resources and knowledge to execute without ever producing the artifact that would make the inference unnecessary. The question stays open, the person stays. The LiDAR scan printout, spread across the site table at the edge of the excavation area on Oak Island's eastern end, showed the island's subsurface as it had never been shown before. The color shifts in the grid indicated anomalies at various depths, some shallow, some well below the water table, some arranged in patterns that the geophysicist who produced the scan had noted in the accompanying report as inconsistent with natural formation. The patterns were real. The anomalies were documented. The grid was printed in color on a large sheet of paper that could be pinned to a wall or spread across a table or rolled and stored in a tube and consulted again whenever the next excavation decision required a reference point for where to dig. The island's underground geometry was visible, finally, as a complete picture. 2 centuries of digging had produced fragments, a depth record here, an auger sample there, a camera image of disputed shapes in dark water, a drill core with a piece of parchment mounted between glass. The scan organized those fragments into a single frame of reference, showed where the anomalies clustered, and where the ground was natural and undisturbed, suggested the rough boundaries of whatever system of chambers and passages the flood tunnel connected to. It was the most complete version of the map that had been accumulating incompletely since the first digger recorded the depth of the first oak platform in the shaft. The LiDAR scan lay on the table. Its grid of colored anomalies represented everything the modern instruments had found beneath the surface of Oak Island, every departure from natural baseline, every void in geometric regularity, every suggestion of chambers or passages arranged with a purpose that the surrounding geology did not provide. After more than 2 centuries of digging, the island had been mapped. What the map showed had not yet been fully explained. The anomalies were real. The explanation remained, as it had remained since the Truro Company's auger returned its sample of loose metal pieces from a depth of nearly 100 feet, exactly as far away as it had always been. One careful excavation season, from confirmation, or several, or many, the distance impossible to judge from the surface. In a workroom in Halifax, in the autumn of 1897, a chemist named A.E. Porter set a small piece of parchment on a wooden bench and looked at it through a magnifying lens. The fragment was no larger than a thumbnail. It had come up inside a drill core, pulled from a depth of approximately 153 feet below the surface of Oak Island, sealed in the gray glacial soil of a flooded shaft along with whatever else the drill had passed through on its long blind journey downward. The parchment rested between 2 pieces of glass, which someone on the excavation team had thought to press it between before making the journey to Halifax. And the care of that decision, the small glass mount prepared for something so fragile, suggested that the people who found it understood they had found something worth preserving. Porter confirmed that the material was genuine parchment and that the ink upon it was India ink. Under the lens, he could make out letters. The characters were variously described by those who examined them as reading V, or UI, or Y, the exact sequence depending on which observer was consulted, and no observer was ever able to read further than those 2 or 3 marks, because that was all the parchment contained, or all it had retained, after more than a century in the ground. That fragment is, by the measure of physical confirmation, the most substantiated piece of evidence that something written was deliberately placed at depth in the Oak Island pit. A chemist examined it. The material was real. The ink was real. The letters, such as they were real. What they formed a part of, whether a word or a name or a sentence from a larger document, the record does not say, because the rest of the document was not recovered. And the drill core that produced this fragment also produced a chamber of loose material at approximately the same depth, which was interpreted by the excavation team as the collapsed or disturbed remains of something that had once been intact. The fragment itself was not, as far as the surviving record shows, retained in any permanent archive. The glass mount and its contents passed through several hands after Porter's examination, and the documented chain of custody ends some decades later. What remains is the chemist's confirmation, the descriptions of the letters, and the quiet fact that a piece of deliberate writing was placed more than 150 feet underground in a shaft on an island in Mahone Bay at some point before anyone had ever dug that deep. The parchment is the thread the physical record holds most firmly. Around it, the other recovered materials exist in varying states of confirmation, loss, and open interpretation. The stone, for instance. Around the time of the earliest organized excavation, workers digging at approximately 90 feet depth reportedly brought up a flat stone bearing symbols arranged in rows. A professor of languages, whose name appears in some accounts as James Leachy, reportedly translated the symbols as a message reading, 40 feet below 2 million pounds are buried. This translation has never been independently verified. The stone itself has since been lost from any confirmed archival location, though one account appearing in later retellings of the island's history places it, in subsequent decades, as a hearthstone in a Halifax bookbinder's shop. Its inscribed face set into the base of a fireplace and gradually obscured by soot, generations of workers passing it without particular interest. Whether that account is accurate cannot be established from surviving documentation. The stone exists now as a reported object, a claim from the oral tradition of the dig, rather than a confirmed artifact in a collection, and the translation it supposedly bore exists as an unverified gloss on a lost original. The question of what the inscribed stone said, or whether it said anything legible at all, belongs to the long list of things about Oak Island that the documentary record records having once been present without being able to confirm in full. The materials recovered from depth have a consistent pattern, found, examined with the instruments available to the period, briefly described, and then moved into circumstances that eventually place them beyond further examination. The coconut fiber recovered from Smith's Cove exists in the same condition, documented, described in Truro Company records from around 1850, confirmed as tropical material by observers who were certain coconut palms did not grow in Nova Scotia, and then distributed, scattered, and eventually unlocatable as intact specimens in any current collection. A few fragments have been preserved by later excavations. The majority of what was found passed through the hands of the excavation companies and into the decades that followed without systematic curation. What modern excavations have added to the physical record is of a different order. During the Legina team's excavations in the island's swamp area, an approximately 2-hectare body of shallow, dark water on the island's western end that has drawn increasing archaeological attention in recent seasons, fragments of human bone were recovered and submitted for laboratory analysis. The radiocarbon dates returned for these fragments placed their deposition within a range spanning roughly the 7th through the 14th centuries of the Common Era. Mitochondrial DNA analysis identified haplogroups associated with populations from Western Europe and the Middle East. These findings do not resolve the question of who deposited human remains in the Oak Island swamp, or why, or whether their presence is connected to the activity that produced the money pit. They do establish that human remains of considerable antiquity are present on the island, that they were placed there during a period long before any documented European settlement of Nova Scotia, and that the individuals whose mitochondrial lineage the bones carry came from populations associated with regions that had active maritime contact with the wider world during that era. The bone fragments rest in the record as confirmed physical evidence of ancient human presence, alongside the parchment as confirmed physical evidence of deliberate inscription at depth. These two classes of object, old bone and old writing, are, in terms of what the laboratory has verified, what the island has most firmly given back. Everything else occupies different positions on the continuum between confirmed, disputed, lost, and speculated. The stone tablet is a reported object whose translation cannot be checked. The coconut fiber is documented material whose origin is unexplained, but not in physical doubt. The fan drain system at Smith's Cove is visible in excavation photographs and has been examined by engineering professionals who have described it as structurally deliberate. The flood tunnel itself has never been directly observed as a complete structure, its existence inferred from the behavior of the water and from fragments of stone-lined channel exposed at intervals across nearly 2 centuries of digging. The geometry of the engineering is consistent with deliberate construction. The record confirms the effects. The record does not confirm, in the form of a surviving plan or document, the hand that designed it. Into the space between the confirmed artifacts and the confirmed effects and the absent documentation, the theories have settled like sediment over the years, each one pressing down on the ones before it. The British military engineering theory is among the more carefully reasoned. Its argument runs as follows. The American Revolutionary War created conditions under which Crown engineers with knowledge of hydraulic tunnel construction and access to Caribbean shipping routes might have had both the means and the motive to construct a concealed repository on an island in a bay on the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, a location that was at that time firmly within British-controlled territory. The engineering knowledge required to design the flood system, the fan drains, and the shaft platforms was well within the documented capabilities of military engineers of the period. The coconut fiber used in the filtration layer at Smith's Cove can be explained as ship's ballast, a common use of the material in Caribbean and Atlantic maritime trade, which would have been carried in the holds of vessels making the crossing. The geometry of the pit, its precise intervals, its hewn log platforms, its water management suggests institutional rather than individual effort, a work party rather than a lone architect. The theory is coherent. It has not been confirmed by any document recovered from British military archives, and searches of those archives have not produced a record of any such operation being authorized, conducted, or subsequently sealed. The absence of a record proves nothing in either direction. Military operations of the period were not always documented, and documents that were created were not always retained. A separate line of interpretation connects the island to the Knights Templar and their rumored treasury, removed from France in the early 14th century and transported across the Atlantic by routes that various researchers have proposed, with varying degrees of documentary support. This theory gained particular traction in the mid-20th century and has continued to circulate in popular accounts of the island. The bone fragments from the swamp, with their mitochondrial haplogroups associated with Middle Eastern populations, have been cited by proponents of this theory as consistent with the presence of individuals who might have been connected to organizations active in the medieval Levant. This interpretation is possible in the technical sense that the haplogroup data does not exclude it, but possible is a long distance from confirmed, and the theory as a whole rests on a chain of inferences rather than a chain of documents. Each link in the reasoning is individually uncertain, and the accumulated uncertainty of a long inferential chain is not reduced by the addition of further links. The record holds this theory at the same distance it holds all others. Here is what the evidence shows. Here is what it does not show. Here is the gap between them. The Freemason theory that the pit was constructed by members of a Masonic fraternity, possibly to conceal documents or valuables connected to the fraternity's archives or ritual history, has appeared in various forms across the island's historiography, partly because the geometric precision of the pit's construction has struck some observers as consistent with the kind of architectural formalism associated with fraternal engineering traditions. The theory has not produced documentary confirmation, and the precision of the construction, while notable, is not exclusive to Masonic practice. Careful engineering is careful engineering. Its origins require more than geometric regularity to establish. The Francis Bacon theory, the argument that the pit was constructed to conceal original manuscripts proving Bacon's authorship of the works attributed to William Shakespeare, is the most literary of the major interpretive frameworks, and in terms of evidentiary grounding, among the more thinly supported. It holds that Bacon, anticipating attacks on his reputation, arranged for a cache of original manuscripts to be transported to Nova Scotia and buried in a manner that would preserve them through centuries of Canadian winters and tidal flooding. The parchment fragment in this reading is a corner of one of those manuscripts. The theory requires a number of conditions to be true simultaneously, none of which has been confirmed, and it represents a case where the identified artifact, the parchment, has been fitted to a pre-existing interpretive desire rather than the interpretation built patiently from the artifact outward. What all these theories share is a relationship to the same physical evidence, the same pit, the same flood system, the same coconut fiber, the same parchment fragment, the same bone, and a common feature of incompleteness where the documentary record would need to support them. The island has been the site of genuine, extraordinary engineering. Something was placed at depth in that shaft, with considerable effort and at considerable skill, and sealed against recovery by a hydraulic system whose basic mechanism has been understood for most of 2 centuries without being overcome. The record does not say what was placed there, or by whom, or why. The record says that something was. The parchment says that someone wrote. The human cost of the search is part of the record as well, and it belongs to any complete account without being its emotional center. In August 1965, 4 men died on Oak Island in a single incident. Robert Restall, who had been working the site for years with his family, descended into a shaft near the money pit and was overcome by gas fumes accumulating in the confined space. His son Bobby descended after him and was similarly overcome. 2 other workers who came to help, Cyril Hiltz and Carl Gracer, were overcome as well. The 4 deaths occurred within the span of a single afternoon, and the incident brought the total number of fatalities connected to Oak Island excavations to 6, counting the worker killed in a boiler explosion in 1861 and a drowning recorded in an earlier dig. The record holds these deaths as facts. They belong to the account of what the island has cost the people who have come to it, which is a legitimate and serious part of its history. There is also a legend. Its origins in the written record are unclear. No reliable pre-20th century source for it having been identified, which holds that the treasure of Oak Island will only reveal itself after 7 people have died in the search. The deaths of the 4 men in 1965, combined with the 2 earlier fatalities, brought the commonly cited count to 6. The legend, to the extent it can be traced, appears to have been in circulation long enough to have shaped how some later participants in the search understood what they were working toward. Whether the legend predates the deaths it seems to anticipate, or whether it was assembled retrospectively around the pattern the deaths created, the surviving documentation does not firmly establish. The legend is noted here as a feature of the island's cultural history, the way a story accumulates around a place that has held its secret for a long time. The place itself has changed considerably from the landscape that Daniel McGuinness and his companions encountered in 1795. The eastern end of the island, where the money pit sits, has been excavated, re-excavated, collapsed, drilled, pumped, and scanned across more than 2 centuries of organized effort. The ground above the pit has been disturbed so many times that the original geometry of the shaft, the precise location of the log platforms, the alignment of whatever chambers the early drillers described passing through, is no longer fully recoverable from surface observation. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR scanning conducted by the Legina team have produced subsurface maps showing anomalies at various depths, color-coded zones of density variation that suggest cavities or material concentrations below the current water table. These maps represent the most complete picture of the island's underground geometry that any generation of searchers has possessed. They do not in themselves resolve the question of what the anomalies contain, because the water table sits above the critical depths, and direct excavation of the lower chambers remains the same problem it has been since the Onslow Company arrived at 90 feet in 1804 and found their shaft filled to 60 feet with ocean water. The connection between the pit and Smith's Cove, the flood tunnel, or tunnels that the prevailing engineering interpretation requires to exist, has been partially confirmed by the excavation of stone-lined channels at Smith's Cove and by the behavior of the water in the pit, which responds to tidal pressure from the Atlantic in a way that is consistent with an open hydraulic connection. A coffer dam constructed at Smith's Cove during a 1970s Triton Alliance excavation allowed workers to examine the beach substrate more closely and produced additional evidence of the artificial filtration layer. The coffer dam was later destroyed by storm action, which is its own small footnote in the island's history of engineering effort meeting Atlantic weather. The fan drain system and the filtration layer are now among the better documented elements of the island's physical record, visible in excavation photographs examined by engineers, described in survey reports. They remain the clearest physical evidence that a significant and deliberate hydraulic construction project was carried out at Smith's Cove, its purpose to feed water into the pit when excavation reached a critical depth. The person who designed that system, whether a single mind or a team, whether working from an established tradition of hydraulic engineering or improvising from first principles on a Nova Scotia beach, left no name in any document that has been found. The design itself is the only signature. The coconut fiber is the only material record of the supply chain that brought tropical goods to this temperate bay for a purpose that has never been confirmed. The parchment is the only legible trace of what may have been placed at the bottom of the effort. These three things, the engineering, the imported material, the written fragment, are the clearest outline of a human story that the island has allowed, and the story they outline is the story of someone, at some point before 1795, going to very considerable lengths to put something somewhere it could not easily be retrieved. What the something was, the record holds in suspension. 2 million pounds in coin or bullion, as the lost stone reportedly suggested. Original manuscripts in a hand that has been argued across centuries. A treasury transported by sea from a conflict on the other side of the world. The payroll of a colonial military establishment. The personal records of a fraternal organization. Something else entirely, or nothing extraordinary, merely a cache of ordinary valuables, sealed with extraordinary care by someone who overestimated the need for security, or whose heirs never returned to claim what was deposited. All of these possibilities exist within the space the record has left open, and none of them can be elevated above the others on the basis of evidence currently in hand. The Lagina brothers and their team have continued to excavate year after year, season after season, with increasing technological sophistication and increasing access to professional archaeological support. The History Channel series that documents their work has run past 10 seasons, which means that for a decade and more, a camera crew has been present on the island through the Atlantic winters and the unpredictable summers, following the slow progress of equipment through waterlogged ground. The series has documented genuine finds, the bone fragments, additional pieces of worked timber, fragments of ceramics, evidence of historical occupation in the swamp area, and genuine frustrations, the water table reasserting itself, the equipment meeting the same resistance the bucket chains met in 1804. The central mystery, which is to say the contents of the pit below the flood threshold remains as it has always been, sealed by water, marked by a piece of writing too small to read in full, and patient in the way that things in the ground are patient, which is to say without any feeling at all about the passage of time. The island sits in Mahoney Bay, as it has always sat, its low tree line barely rising above the water, its eastern ground marked by fences and equipment, and the collapsed and recollapsed ground above the shaft, its western swamp dark and shallow and rich with ancient material. The causeway crosses the tidal flat to the mainland, and the cars that cross it in any given season carry researchers, television crews, curious visitors, and people who have spent years thinking about what the pit contains. The bay around the island holds its 360 other islands in the same gray water, indifferent to the particular attention the one island has drawn. The parchment fragment, if it still exists in the form Porter examined it, is somewhere in the long chain of custody that began in Halifax in 1897 and has not been confirmed to a current location. Its letters, V or UI or II, depending on who was reading, are a beginning without a continuation or a middle without context or an end without a preceding sentence, and the uncertainty of even those 2 or 3 marks is itself a kind of summary of what the island offers, enough to confirm that something was there, not enough to say what it was. The bone in the swamp carries a story of ancient human presence on the island, of people whose mitochondrial lineage traces back to populations from 2 continents, of some event or series of events that left human remains in a shallow body of water on the western end of an island in the North Atlantic. The laboratory report that confirmed the radiocarbon date and the haplogroup designations is a document of the kind that did not exist before the mid-20th century, and the fact that it can now be produced, that the island's soil can be asked questions that would have been unanswerable to every generation of searchers before this one, is a real change in what the search can do. The answers the laboratory has given are real answers. They are also answers to questions that do not, by themselves, explain the pit. The pit, which has drawn more than 200 years of organized human effort and an amount of capital that would be difficult to calculate across all the companies and individuals who have invested it, remains below the water table on the eastern end of the island, its precise geometry altered by the repeated excavations and collapses of those 2 centuries, its lower chambers inaccessible to direct examination without a solution to the flood system that has not yet been found. The engineering that protects it has worked without maintenance for as long as it has existed. The coconut fiber in the filtration layer at Smith's Cove is still in the ground under the beach, or what remains of it after the excavations that have disturbed the cove's substrate across several seasons of digging. The fan drains have been partially exposed and partially destroyed by those same excavations. The hydraulic principle they embody, the principle that tidal pressure from the Atlantic will fill the shaft faster than any pump can empty it, has been confirmed by every generation of searchers who has reached the critical depth and watched the water rise. There is something in the long record of this island that is not quite like anything else in the documented history of treasure seeking, which is the consistency with which it has defeated not just 1 or 2, but dozens of organized, well-funded, technologically sophisticated attempts across a span of time that covers the entire recorded history of European presence in Atlantic Canada. Other searches have ended in discovery or in documented failure. This one has ended, each time in the same place. The water at 60 feet, the pumps running without effect, the season turning toward autumn, and the investors turning toward solvency. The pit has absorbed every generation of seekers, and given back just enough to sustain the next one. The log platforms, the coconut fiber, the parchment fragment, the stone-lined channels, the tidal gauge moving in its patient arc. The record does not say whether what lies below the water is worth what has been spent to reach it. The record is not equipped to say that, and the question involves values, financial, historical, cultural, that shift with the person asking them. What the record says is that something is there, or was placed with the intention of remaining there, and that the effort taken to protect it was extraordinary by any measure, and that the effort taken to recover it has been extraordinary as well, and that the two efforts have balanced each other, without resolution, for a period of time longer than most nations have existed in their current form. The eastern end of the island is quiet now, in the way that excavation sites are quiet when the equipment has been shut down and the crew is gone. The fences around the money pit area stand in the dark, their wire catching no particular light. Below the surface, below the disturbed ground of 2 centuries of digging, below the water table that sits above the critical depth, the shaft continues downward into the gray glacial soil of a Nova Scotia island, and at some point in that descent, at 153 feet, or at 90 feet, or at whatever depth the original deposit was placed, the record becomes entirely quiet. No instrument has yet returned a clear image of what is there. No drill core has come up with more than a thumbnail of writing. The flooding has continued without interruption. The parchment sits in its glass mount, somewhere in the long passage of time since 1897, its letters legible and unreadable at once, its meaning intact in the soil of the island, even if the fragment itself has been lost to the chain of custody that holds it loosely and without a confirmed address. The bone in the swamp keeps its radiocarbon date, its mitochondrial haplogroup, its quiet evidence of presence. The water in the pit keeps its tidal rhythm, rising and falling, with the Atlantic in the slow, patient arc that no bucket chain and no pump and no cofferdam has yet interrupted for long enough to matter. Whatever was placed in the ground of Oak Island was placed by someone who understood that the most effective protection is not a lock which can be picked or a guard which can be overcome, but water which is patient in exactly the same way that the thing it protects has learned, by long practice, to be patient